So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jen Tremin, and I am the Associate Director of Empower Programming at the Atlanta Beltline Partnership. If you're not familiar with us, we are the nonprofit entity for the Atlanta Beltline. Tonight, you are joining us for one of our home empowerment workshops. These are free workshops put on with great partners to help homeowners and renters learn about some resources that are available to help them be more secure in their homes. So tonight, we are partnering with Atlanta Legal Aid and Grove Park Foundation to teach Fulton County homeowners about their property tax assessment and their different options for appealing. We all know that property taxes have been on the rise for some time in Fulton County, and this can be a primary cause of displacement. You share any information tonight that you find useful. So throughout the presentation, you will be able to ask our presenters questions. Just make sure you do that in the Q&A, or if you can on Facebook Live, you can put that in the comments section. We will also be hosting some free one-on-one appointments later next month, and I will share more information on that at the end of the webinar. Now, before I turn it over to Atlanta Legal Aid, I want to share one more resource that we have available. So for homeowners in the Beltline neighborhoods over on the west and south side, the Legacy Resident Retention Program is available to help legacy residents pay the increase in their property taxes until 2030. So if you are located in those neighborhoods, you want to learn more, go to beltline.org/retention fund to see the qualifications and how to apply. I will put that in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Stacey.
Okay, thank you. I'm Stacey Reynolds. I'm an attorney at Atlanta Legal Aid, and I am very happy to be back here again talking about tax appeals. What we're going to be looking at is Fulton County, how to lower your property taxes, primarily with tax appeals. I'm here, I've got Carrie Hipp, who's going to be doing a lot of the monitoring the questions and interrupting when needed and helping to nudge me along. And then also Sarah Kelsey is here to help me with fielding questions. So, but I'll be the one doing most of the talking, so bear with me. So today, what we're going to talk about, it's basically 4 parts, and there's a lot of information to cover, so I'm going to try and go through it pretty quickly. I will try and pause at each section to answer some questions, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to be able to answer more questions. So we're going to start with talking about why do tax assessments matter, how can we reduce the taxable value of the home, and how to understand the assessment. Part 2, we'll be looking at really how to dig in and research to figure out what value you should be asserting in these appeals. Part 3, we're going to be talking about exactly the mechanics of how do you actually file that appeal. And then the final part is what to expect once you file the appeal. So the first thing is, why do tax assessments matter? And the reason they matter is that as the market increases, the property assessments also go up, which can result in dramatic property tax increases that can particularly impact the low-income homeowners. It can impact people by, having escrow shortages. If your mortgage is paying your taxes, they've estimated it based on a certain amount, and if it suddenly goes up a lot, then they're going to pay out more than what they've estimated for. They're going to come back and say, hey, you have to make up this difference, and we're going to charge you more for this coming year. And so it can be kind of a double whammy that could lead to the mortgage being unaffordable and possible mortgage foreclosures. If you don't have a mortgage company that's paying your taxes, then that could lead to tax liens or tax foreclosure, which obviously are also bad things. And then there's also people out there that are looking to take advantage of the situation. So there's some predatory practices that are being developed for ways to take advantage of people who are having trouble paying their taxes. So we want to try and help people make sure that they keep the taxes as low as possible. Basically, the ways you do that, there's kind of 2 pieces to it, and it's laid out across the timeline. The first one is the homestead exemptions. And that part is actually earlier in the year. So really the focus on homestead exemptions, we did a session before about that because we want to make sure that people know about that before the April 1st deadline. If you don't apply for the exemption by April 1st, then you don't have the right to get it for this year. If the If you apply now, you still can apply, but it's going to apply for next year. So it's too late really to do anything about the homestead exemptions unless they're not appearing on your assessment, in which case you want to appeal it. So where we are now is in the appeals part of the timeline. And that's basically from now until the end of the year and really into next year. Specifically where we are is right here. You have received your notice of assessment if you're in Fulton County, or it's been made available. And unfortunately, the timeline for appealing is based on when it's made available. So from the date it was made available, you have 45 days to appeal. And that means that you have until August 5th of this year to appeal your property tax. You'll notice on the timeline, the time to appeal ends before your tax bill comes out. So by the time your tax bill comes out, it is too late to appeal. So, you know, those people who are waiting, I go, well, to see what my taxes look like, then I'll appeal. It's too late. You have to do it within this 45-day period. So we want to make sure that people understand that. I'll repeat that a few times through this presentation. August 5th is the important date. The rest of the timeline, we'll be going over this in a little bit more detail later, but I just want to mention that, you know, if you do file your appeal, that tax bill is going to be a temporary tax bill. You're going to have to pay that and then save the money to, if it turns out that your final bill after all the appeal is done is more, you want to have the money available to be able to pay it at that point. After your tax bill comes out, then you'll get a sort of an initial response from the county about your appeal, either saying that there's no change, that they're not going to change the value that they're saying, in which case they'll send it to the Board of Equalization. If the response is that they're going to change it, they can either change it to the value that you've asked for or to a third value, in which case you need to say that you want it appealed to the Board of Equalization. The advantage of appealing to the Board of Equalization is that you get a freeze. You can get an automatic 3-year freeze if you appear at the Board of Equalization. That means that the value, whatever value is decided, is not going to go up this year, next year, or the year after that. So it's actually, you know, as the prices continue to kind of go up and up and up, that can be a win in itself. So it's something to keep in mind. I just want to touch base on exemptions. I'm not going to go into this. Like I said, the timeline for that is gone. We have a whole other presentation on that. But I just want to mention that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of exemptions. The basic exemption in most jurisdictions comes with a floating exemption, which is huge. But you also, as your life circumstances change, you want to go back and look to see if you're eligible for any additional exemptions. And if you've applied for any additional exemptions, this is going to come into play when we're talking about appealing. So I just want to say, you know, there's different ones for as you turn 62, 65, 70, become disabled, certain other life events. These are all things that you want to keep in mind. And when I say that the basic comes with a floating exemption, a lot of people say, well, what is that? Or they say, you know, hey, I've heard there's a value cap. You know, why is my value going up? Well, the value cap and the floating exemption are actually the same thing. It's just a difference in how you calculate it. And you see from the chart, I actually had to do the math to try and convince myself that it really was the same thing, because I did not understand how they do it. But basically, what they do is they have a base year. That base year can only go up as much as 3% each year. And so that's what your taxable value is. From that, they subtract out any additional exemptions and get your net assessment and multiply that by the tax rate to come up with how much your taxes are. When you're doing it from their perspective, they use the 40% of the fair market value and then subtract the difference between that and the capped value, as well as the additional exemptions you get. And so the net assessment ends up being the same. But this all brings up the question of, well, if there's a value cap, why do I need to appeal? And the reason for that is this value cap does not apply to all categories of your tax bill. You want to be sure that you stay on top of the value, because there are certain categories that it's not going to help you with. And so, you know, the only way to keep the whole tax bill down is to go ahead and appeal the value to you, even though there is that floating exemption. Again, the deadline is 45 days from the date the notice of assessments were made available. Receipt of the notice is not required and will not postpone that 45 days. So if you did not receive it, you're still can be considered to have gotten it because it's been made available. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to find it. If you didn't actually receive it in the mail, you can go online and pull it up. What you want to do is go to the fultonassessor.org website, click on the property search, and search for your property. And I'm going to go into more detail about how to find your property in another section. So right now I just want to show you the screen. So, pretend this is your property. What you want to do is look on that right-hand side where it says reports, look for the 2021 real estate notice and ask to pull that up. And that should download the notice of assessment. You can also find a lot of the information in the notice of assessment just in the information that they have on the website. But there is some information on the notice of assessment that's not available on the website. This is what the notice of assessment looks like. I'm going to spend a few minutes sort of getting some of the highlights. But this is what you should have gotten it in the mail. It says this is not a bill, so a lot of people just disregard it. But you want to actually take a minute to look at it and consider whether or not you want to appeal it. Then, so the key pieces up here in the right-hand corner, it's going to tell you exactly the date that it was issued and the deadline. Again, as you can see, the deadline this year is August 5th. You want to be sure to appeal by that date. It's going to tell you the parcel ID number or the property ID number. And this is going to be important because there's a couple places in the appeal form that you're going to need to put that number in. So it's helpful to know where to find that number. It's going to tell you what the exemption status is. So if you're showing if you apply for a homestead exemption and this says no under homestead exemption, it means that they're not showing that exemption. And so you need to appeal that. It may be that they're just still processing the exemption. And if that's the case, then you can, if you appeal it and they process it and you end up getting the exemption, you can actually just withdraw the appeal. There's no harm in that. But if you don't appeal it and they end up not giving it to you, this was your chance to appeal. So you want to be sure to get that appeal in. Also, if it shows HF01 and you've applied for an exemption of a senior exemption or some higher exemption than just the basic exemption, then you want to appeal that. If you're not sure what the code means, you can call the Fulton Assessor's office and ask them what exemption are you getting to make sure that you're getting the right ones. Last thing, so then the next thing you want to look at, and probably the most important thing on this, is the current year fair market value. This is what they are saying your house is worth this year. So you want to pay attention to what that is. They have the previous year, so you can compare it right there. How much did it go up? If it goes up a good bit, you want to think about appealing. The other piece of information that's helpful is that they give you an estimated tax. What this is basically using last year's millage rates and the value that they've got for this year and calculating what your tax bill would have been if this was the value last year. Now, the county, the cities, the schools, they're all working on figuring out what their millage rates are going to be this year. So they could be different. So that means that the amount that you end up paying may be more or less than what's shown here. But this is just to give you an estimate of, how much the new value is going to affect your bottom line.
And Stacy, we've got one question I think is probably applicable here, and it's about a new homeowner and the current fair market value that they might see, that they will probably see on their notice of assessment.
Okay, if they bought the house in 2020, the new value should be what they paid for it. Assuming it was an arm's length transaction, it should be what they paid for it. And if it's more than what they paid for it, they should appeal it. If it's less than what they paid for it, they may not want to say anything. But by statute, they have the right to have it be the amount that they paid for it or less. And if it's if the home that hasn't been sold, basically what they're doing is trying to guess what it would sell for. And so that's where appealing it for anyone who didn't just buy the home is we're gonna talk a good bit about how to figure that out. But deciding whether or not to appeal, kind of the big things are, was there a big jump, and is this going to affect my bottom line? So those are two key things. The next thing we want to talk about is, what are the grounds for appeal? Because again, when you're thinking about whether or not to appeal, you want to think about, what reasons can I use? So the three grounds for appeal, there's value, uniformity, and exemption denied. I'm going to kind of go backwards on these. So because exemption denied is pretty obvious. If you applied for an exemption and it's not showing up, or it's the incorrect exemption, or if you had an exemption and suddenly it's saying no exemption or a lower exemption, you want to appeal that. Uniformity is sort of a fairness argument. It's saying that your house should be valued at roughly the same as other similar houses so that you end up paying, roughly the same amount in taxes. If your house is being valued higher than some other similar houses in your neighborhood, then that's a good argument for trying to get the value lower. And this is going to be looking at what the 2021 appraised value is. So what the tax assessor's office thinks your house is worth and what it thinks the other houses are worth. And that's going to be regardless of whether they were sold or not. Value, there's kind of two pieces to it. There's one is that if the information that they have about your property is wrong, then and the correct information about your property would justify a lower value, then you want to appeal that, and that's a value appeal. The other piece of the other kind of value appeal is looking at recent sales. And so what they're doing is trying to, again, what they're trying to do is guess what your house would be worth if it had sold last year. If it didn't sell last year, that's going to be a harder thing to show. But so what they're going to be looking at is the sales from last year, because they're looking at the value as of January 1st. So any sales that happened after January 1st are going to affect your value next year. But the the sales that happened last year are going to factor into what the value should be for this year. And so you're going to be looking at other houses that sold last year to see if there's some that justify a lower value for your home. So these are the things that you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about, should I appeal? So this is a graphic that I actually saw this on Facebook and immediately grabbed it. I tried to figure out who created it and I couldn't find it, but I think that it's a good illustration of exactly what we're talking about. Basically, what you want to do is present enough evidence to allow the Board of Equalization to believe that your home is worth what you think it's worth versus what the tax assessor's office thinks it's worth. So the next part of our discussion is going to be sort of digging into where do you find the evidence that helps you convince the Board of Equalization. I want to pause here. Are there any questions sort of about the assessment or lowering the taxes?
There are some questions, but it's mostly definitely things we're going to get into. A few remaining homestead exemption questions, though, are if I have a home in another state and have a homestead exemption, can I also get a homestead exemption in Atlanta with my home?
No, the rule of thumb is that you can only have one primary residence. And so you can only get the homestead exemption in one place. If you already have it someplace else, then you can't get it here. If this really is your primary residence, you can relinquish it at the other place and apply for it here, but you can't get it in both places.
And we've definitely had a few different people ask the question of whether you need to reapply for a homestead exemption every year, how long is it active, et cetera.
Yeah, and for the homestead exemption question, I want to refer people to the presentation we did before, but just real quick, once you apply for the exemption, unless there is one senior Fulton County exemption that's a 2-year exemption, but for most of them, they just continue. And so you don't have to keep reapplying. Once you've applied for it, you're good. But that's for that specific exemption. If you have the basic exemption and you turn 62 and would qualify for the 62 exemption, you need to apply for that. And again, at 65 and at 70, as things change, you want to apply. And really, it doesn't hurt to check with the assessor's office to see if there are any exemptions that might be available that you aren't getting.
And one more, well, I guess there are a couple, but one of them we can definitely answer already in the chat. One more question. If you move out of your house and rent elsewhere, do you lose your homestead exemption?
If you're not living in the house, then you're not entitled to the exemption. So again, it needs to be your primary residence. Okay, so I'm going to move into researching the values, and this is looking at where to dig for information. Before I get into that, though, I do want to give one word of warning. Again, the deadline to appeal is here. The deadline to appeal is August 5th. If you do not have the time to do the research, or if you run out of time doing the research, it is more important to get the appeal in than to get the research completed. The real deadline for doing this research is going to be when you're going to the Board of Equalization. So, if it's too stressful to get the research done now, it's okay to do it a little bit later. The reason for doing it now is that it allows you to be able to assert a value that you know you can defend. But if you don't have the time to do the research, you can just assert a value, sort of lowball the value, and then you can change that value later if you decide there's a different value that you think you should be arguing. So I just wanted to file the appeal is much more important than doing the research right now. But if you can do the research, it's a good idea to do it. So where to find the information? The best source of information really is what the Fulton Assessor has themselves. So their website, the fultonassessor.org website, if you click on property search, it's going to take you to IAS Public Access, Fulton County, ga.gov. With this, and that's the main website that they have of all the information that they use. And I'm going to refer to that either as Fulton Assessor or IAS Public Access. It's a lot easier to say Fulton Assessor, so that's probably what I'll be doing. But when I'm referring to that, I'm usually referring to the property search. The other website that is also really helpful is QPublic, the Fulton County version of QPublic. The easiest way to find that is to just Google QPublic Fulton GA and look for the link that has Fulton County QPublic.net Schneider Corporation. I do want to give a little caveat here. There are some definite advantages to using QPublic in some circumstances, but right now they do not have the 2021 tax information. So they don't have the most up-to-date information about the properties. So if you're using the QPublic, definitely refer back to the Fulton Assessor website to make sure that the information is correct and up to date and all that. From last year, what happened is they updated the QPublic a little bit later in the year and ended up having the 2021 information. But there's a little bit of a lag there. So while you're doing the research now, you want to be careful that the information you're using is really the most up-to-date. So Fulton Assessor's website is the more up-to-date version right now. But I'm going to do both of them because there are some advantages to QPublic that I don't want to have people miss out on. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is actually start with researching what do they have about your home. And with that, again, you want to start with the Fulton Assessor website. So that is literally the information that they're using in creating these notices of assessment. So you go to the fultonassessor.org website, click on property search. It's going to bring you to this search page. And you have basically 4 options for searching. One is owner search, parcel search, address search, and then advanced search. I'm not going to go into advanced search right now. We're going to go into that a little bit more detail later. But when you're pulling up just a specific address, the other 3 are actually better sources for doing that. So, you can do owner search and type in the last name, first name, no comma, to pull it up, or you can do the parcel ID number, or you can do the address search. I will say the search is very persnickety, so sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out what it is they want. So if your home has like North Main Street or whatever, is it in Main Street, or is it just, do they spell out north? So sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what the search engine is looking for to pull up your property. But if you stick with it, you kind of can. The QPublic, sorry. So this is what it looks like when you pull up your property on the Fulton Assessor's website. They have a menu on that left-hand side, and you can sort of click through and look at all the information that they have about your home and see, what the data is. Or you can look it up on the QPublic website. The QPublic search engines is basically the same types of search, but in this case, it has predictive text, so it makes it a little bit easier if you can't find it on the other one. What I do a lot of times is come to QPublic and start typing it in, and it'll sort of guess what you're trying to say. And doing that, you can figure out what the hang up was on the other. And so sometimes I'll do that and then go back to Fulton Assessor to pull it up. Either way, basically the same information comes up on the QPublic. It's all just one page. I can just keep scrolling down and see all the information, but it's basically the same information. QPublic has some stuff in like more, more real English. So they'll say, frame house or things like that. But either way, you can look for the same information. And if your house hasn't really changed, then probably the information that they have on QPublic is the same as Fulton Assessor, but again, double check. So the things you're going to be looking for are like, the number of stories, what type of exterior you have, the year built, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, whether or not you have central heat and air, what grade factor they give the house, what the CDU, the condition something in utility. I'll have a screen in a minute that does that. That sort of rates your house as anywhere from excellent down to very poor and uninhabitable. You want to look at the neighborhood code. This is just a 4 or 5 digit code that tells what neighborhood the tax assessor has your house in. Some of us think of the neighborhood as, actual words and, defined by certain areas like East Point, but the neighborhood codes will actually subdivide that. And sometimes even houses on the same street will have different neighborhood codes. So whenever possible, you want to try and compare your house to other ones that have the same neighborhood code. So it's useful to find that number. You also want to look at what the current value is. Again, QPublic right now does not have the most up-to-date numbers. So what you want to do for that is definitely look at the Fulton Assessor website until QPublic gets that information. But these are all the things that you kind of want to look at and compare and think about, are these things accurate? You want to review that property information about your home and think, is it accurate? Think about what square footage they have. If the square footage is off by more than 300 square feet and it's measured from the outside, it is off if they have it as larger than what your actual home is by more than 300 square feet, then that's going to mean that they're overstating the value of your home. That's going to increase the value. So you can appeal saying that, my square footage is actually this, and they would probably have to come and measure it, but that would be a value appeal. You want to look at what they have about the quality of construction. Think about it. So condition, desirability, or utility, that's the CDU that they have. So if they have that your house is in very good condition, but you know that there's some sort of damage, especially if it's like water or structural damage, you can probably argue for a lower CDU. You can argue that your house is really more accurately described as fair or, average, rather than the very good or whatever they have. So that's one way to sort of knock things down a little bit. Look at what they have for the accessory buildings. If, like there was a garage that has been torn down or just never existed, that affects the value. And so you want to, note that they've got some incorrect information. Also, if they have the incorrect information about the, HVAC, the heat and air, that affects the value. Also, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, if there's a finished basement, an attic, that sort of thing, those all affect the value. So if any of that information is not correct and the information that they have would justify a higher value, you definitely want to appeal that. That is a value appeal. The other thing you want to do while you're reviewing the property information on these websites is you want to gather information about your home in order to be able to compare your home to these other homes. Because what you're going to want to do is be comparing your home to other similar homes. So you definitely want to think about like the square footage, the year built, the quality of the home, that all of that stuff is going to go into what is similar. Let's talk about similar. If your house is in a neighborhood full of houses that are identical, that's easy. They're all similar. So, you know, you don't have to really work at what would be similar. But if your house is in a neighborhood where they're not all similar, you know, if your house is sitting next to one of the big mansions that are being built, that's just, it's not equal. They're not similar. You want to try and find other houses that are similar, again, in terms of the number of floors, the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, year built, quality of construction, all that stuff. You want to try and find that. If you can't find any other similar houses that, that help your argument, one way to compare your house to the mansion down the street is a price per square foot, you know, or, you know, even if they're just a little bit dissimilar, you can use the price per square foot to make things more accurate. The price per square foot is basically taking the overall value of the home divided by the square footage of the house. And so, you know, you'd be taking, in the uniformity appeals, you're going to be taking the fair market value divided by the square footage of the house. Or if you're doing a sales and you're going to take the sale price divided by the square footage. And that gives you a little bit more of an apples to apples, because you can then take that number and multiply it by the square footage of your house. So someone's going to pay more for the big house than for, you know, a smaller house, but the price per square foot can sort of translate that. That's one way to sort of deal with the fact that houses generally are not exactly the same. Okay. So let's talk about how to do a value research. Again, with a value, the first part is, you know, whether the information about your house is accurate. We've already talked about that. The second type of value appeal is looking at sales. So in order to research this, you're going to be looking for sales from the prior year. So for an appeal this year, you're going to be looking at 2020 sales. In order to do that, both QPublic and Public Act and the Fulton Assessor website have searches that you can do to find those sales. But this is really where QPublic excels. It makes it so easy. So this is why I've kept the QPublic in this presentation, just so that, you know, you can do this. Basically, they have a button. So all you have to do is enter the sales date range to do just the 2020 sales. Click the button, and it's going to come up with a list of sales in that neighborhood that that sold in 2020. It's like magic. So they also have a sales search, you know, whatever tab that you can use that allows you to add other criteria to narrow the search. So you can do that, but again, the button is just so easy. Once you do that, it's going to come up with a list of all the sales from 2020 in that neighborhood. And you can either use that, that page that they bring up and work through that list, or you can download it into an Excel spreadsheet. The reason I like downloading it to an Excel spreadsheet is, again, the price per square foot is an easy way to compare properties. And so I just add a column in the Excel spreadsheet that says, you know, it's the price per square foot. And then I can sort it and only look at the ones that have a lower price per square foot, because we're looking for things that are going to support a lower value. So it just makes it, you know, easier to sort of designate which ones you're going to look at. The Fulton Assessor's website actually has a wonderful tool, which is the advanced search. It's just not quite as easy. It's not as easy as just clicking a button. With the advanced search, you're going to want to select specific criteria to narrow the search. The first thing you definitely want to do is the neighborhood code. And then you also want to do the sales date range to do just the 2020. If you do that and it's below the magic 250, then it'll pull up all of the sales in your neighborhood that, that you need to look at. If the number of sales in your neighborhood is more than 250, then you're going to have to narrow it a little bit more. And then it will, so doing this will also bring up a list that you can work off of. If you include show in the results, the criteria that you've asked for, it will show that. So in this case, we use sales price and square foot to try and narrow the number of sales. And so it'll show that in your results. And then you can use the parcel number to see those properties. But the true magic of the advanced search is if you download it into an Excel spreadsheet. So if you select all and then do attribute export and hit go, it should allow you to download it. It's either an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV, comma separated value table. And with that, it actually brings up all sorts of information that doesn't appear if you're just looking at this screen. It actually brings up like the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, the year built, all sorts of information that ties into whether a home is similar to yours. Plus, you have the advantage of being able to add that price per square foot column to help you sort through the properties to figure out which ones you really need to go and look at. So it can be an easy way to sort of eyeball what the different properties are that are similar to yours and do that. The problem is getting the search down enough to allow you to export it, because it has very severe limits on being able to do that. But if you can get it down, it's a wonderful tool. You can also look at sales by looking at the maps. There are layers available on the maps to be able to sort of highlight the ones that have sold in the given year. Obviously, I haven't updated this screen, but this is the Fulton Assessor's website. And if you do layers, which is the little stack of pages, that'll bring up a little screen where you can click and ask for it to show you yearly sales for 2020. And then when you go to the map after that, it's going to have those in a special color. You do want to check the little I button again, just so that once you are back on the regular screen, you can click on each of the other parcels to bring up information. So you can see here, they've got them color coded for sales in different years. And you can click on the parcel to bring up basic information about the property. Click on the little sales tab and it'll show you specifically, what the sales information was. And if you want to see more about that property, just click on the parcel ID number and it'll bring up the information about that property.
Stacy, I had a quick question from the chat. So when they say neighborhood, what does that mean? Does that mean the tax district? Like, what is that neighborhood number?
The neighborhood code is just this, I don't know how to explain it. Basically what they've done is they've carved up the entire county into smaller neighborhoods. And then, so it used to be that all the neighborhood codes were 4-digit neighborhood codes. Then they went back and they carved up some of those 4-digit ones and created some 5-digit ones. And so they tend to be, houses nearby, but sometimes they will kind of parcel out. Like if there's infill housing, that may be a different neighborhood code than, like the 1920s bungalows that have been there forever. But I don't have a good explanation of exactly how they create these neighborhood codes. You just have to, that's why I pointed out where you look for it, on the property information to find that neighborhood code. It's also on your assessor, your notice of assessment, so that you can be looking at just that 4 or 5-digit code. The other kind of tricky thing is if you put in a 4-digit code and there is a 5-digit code that starts with that, a lot of times it'll still bring up the 5-digit codes as well. And so you want to be kind of careful that you're looking just at the ones in your neighborhood code if possible. Anything else right now?
We've got some things that I think that you're going to cover. There were a few more niche questions. There is still a lot of confusion about the value cap. I know that's kind of you talked about it earlier, but people are quite confused about the value cap, which I think is something that we've had happen before. It's
very confusing. And with that, I think I would rather talk about that at the end.
Okay.
And maybe I can go back to that screen and talk through it a little bit more.
Okay. One person did ask, is there any kind of bad outcome from appealing? Are they going to change the property value higher?
The worst case scenario from appealing is that you may be stuck with the value that they've set. They are not allowed to go to a higher value than what is in the notice of assessment. So again, even if you lose, even if you get to the Board of Equalization and they say, you know what, the assessor was right, this is really the value of your home, that still is, you still get the freeze. So, you know, next year when the values go up again, you kind of won, you know, even though you lost, you get that freeze. So, so there really isn't a downside to appealing. The one, if your home, you know, if the information they have about your home is that you have, you know, if they're saying you have fewer bedrooms or bathrooms than what you actually have, and you're doing a condition argument and they come out and look at it, they can redo the property information to account for the additional, you know, bedrooms, bathrooms, that sort of thing. So that can be a negative outcome, but as far as the value that they come up with, they can't come out with you can't come out with a higher value at the Board of Equalization level. Okay. So with doing a map search for recent sales, you can do that also on the Q Public website. They have a view map and it brings up a map. And I find it a little bit easier because the layers are right there on the side. And so it's easy for you to pick that you want to see the yearly sales, and then it has it color coded. It has the information kind of set out down at the bottom. And if you want to see more information about the property, you just click on report and be able to see more. And you just sort of click around to other parcels that have sold to be able to, you know, to see what those houses are like, and you know, if there's some that give you a good argument. But really, for sales, I tend to stick with doing either the Q Public, clicking on the button, or the advanced search. I don't usually use the maps for sales anymore, but this is one option. Some people it's just easier and you know, it's kind of fun to click around and look at the other properties. As you start looking at sales, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that they'll have some indication about it being qualified or unqualified or valid or invalid. And all a qualified sale is an arm's length transaction between a knowledgeable buyer and a knowledgeable seller. This is just, you know, like two independent people, you know, are getting together and discussing what they are willing to pay for the house and what they're willing to sell the house for. And if there's a meeting of the minds, that should be a qualified sale. There are a lot of things that are marked as qualified or unqualified that I think should be qualified. For example, if the house was remodeled or renovated after sale, if your home is one that would have to be remodeled or renovated after sale, your house is more like the one that was sold before it got remodeled. And so that should be, you know, a qualified sale. That was an arm's length transaction. The only reason it's not qualified is that the person who bought that house, if they renovated it after they bought it, then they're not necessarily going to get that automatic sale value from, you know, when they bought it. So this is the exception to the answer earlier that if you bought the house and then renovated it, even though the sale price should be the value in the following year, the one exception to that is if there was renovations that would or improvements that would justify a higher value. But you know, absent that, you should get the sale value. The other thing is that a lot of times they'll mark things as being sold between related parties where I'm not sure that they actually are related. You know, a lot of times they'll do that just because it happens to be two companies, you know, two LLCs that have sold it between each other. If they're independent, then you know, that should be a qualified sale, and it should be something that we can use as an argument. Now, things like if it's, you know, a sale between related parties, you know, where a mother sells the property to her son, or you know, something like that, or if it's just, you know, for love and affection or for $10, that's not going to be a qualified sale, and I don't see an argument for that. But for some of these others, you can make an argument that it really should be allowed to be used as a good comparable for a sale. But if you can make an argument based on qualified sales, it's best to go with that. So that's basically the research for where to find information for a value appeal for sales. You can sort of round out the research by also doing some internet searches. Google Street View can be fabulous, especially for those ones where it was renovated or remodeled after sale, because if you do a Street View, you can actually click on a thing to look at old pictures, and you can see, you know, the way the house looked before the renovation and then after. And so that can be a really good graphic of, see, this house is much more like my house than this end result is. And so, you know, that can help you with making the argument. Also, you can find, you know, like pictures from the marketing for the sale of the home that can show whether it was, you know, fixed up in much better condition than yours and all that stuff. And so, you know, the internet has all sorts of interesting information that you can use to make the argument that that your house should be a lower value than some of these sales. So now we're going to go into the uniformity piece of it. Again, this is going to be looking at just what the tax assessor believes the house is worth this year. This is going to be looking at the 2020 fair market values in the tax assessor's website. And this does not have anything to do with whether or not they were sold. So you can look at any house in the neighborhood to figure out if it's something that would help you. What you're looking for is a house that would justify a lower value. These are Easter eggs. I mean, you're really looking for that kind of needle in a haystack that would justify a lower value. To do that, there's you can do it using maps, and you can also do it using the advanced search. This is where the maps really, I think, are much more fun, and, you know, I don't know, it's just more fun. For right now, if you're going to do a search for uniformity, I would focus just on the Fulton Assessor website, because again, right now, QPublic does not have the 2021 appraised values. So it's not going to be any good until it gets that information. But you can use the Fulton Assessor website maps. And once QPublic gets the information, you can use their maps and just click around. Just, you know, when you click on the map on the menu for your property, it'll bring up your property, and then, like, you know, all the others around it. Just start clicking on the ones, you know, and just walk down the street and see what the houses are appraised for, and see if you can make an argument for, you know, your house should be taxed lower than these others. You can also do the advanced search. Again, the wonderful thing about this is that it can give you a spreadsheet that has all the information right there. So you don't have to click down the street. You can just look at this chart and try and find homes that are similar and use those. You know, the main thing you have to do is the neighborhood code. Again, that's the 4 or 5 digit code. And then you just sort of want to play with it to try and narrow it down to get it to the point where you can actually, you know, get it under the 250 limit to be able to see everything. And then it has to be even a little bit lower than that to be able to export it. But it can be a really useful way of looking at other homes in the area and try and get sort of similar ones to compare to. So things to keep in mind when you're looking at uniformity is that if the home you're comparing your home to was appealed in 2019 or 2020, they may still be under that 3-year freeze. So you want to look to see, you know, is this value really the 2019 value that's been frozen for 3 years, or is it a new value for 2021? You can also look to see if there are more similar homes. You know, you kind of want to keep playing around until you find the most similar that gives you the best argument. And you definitely want to avoid using uninhabitable houses if your home is really livable. We did once make an argument that, you know, part of the house had, the ceiling had collapsed, so part of the house was uninhabitable. So if we kind of did part of the house based on this, you know, uninhabitable comparable, and then part of the house based on what they had said, then, you know, we could come to an agreement on a value. But for the most part, if you can live in your house, you don't want to compare it to an uninhabitable one. Additional appeal evidence that you can gather, and this is really, you can use this either for the value or for uniformity. You can get recent appraisals. If the recent appraisal shows that there is different property information, then you can use that to help you support a value appeal. Also, if it shows a value that's lower than what they're claiming, then that's really good evidence. If the appraisal shows a higher value, you're not obligated to use that evidence. And certainly I would think twice about using it for anything if it's going to show that actually, you know, it should be worth more. Photographs are fabulous, especially if you have any sort of condition argument, then photographs carry a lot of weight. You know, you can describe the issues and your testimony is fine evidence, but I can tell you how much the photographs can sway the Board of Equalization. And then also if you have repair estimates, that's a pretty good, easy way to argue, well, you know, it's going to cost $10,000 to replace the roof. You know, that's, then let's just take 10,000 off the value of the property. So these are all things that are really useful. Also, you know, just, again, what you're trying to do is justify a lower value. So think creatively, think about things that might show that or might support that argument. Okay, so we're about to get into how to submit the appeal. Are there any more questions about the research?
Yes, I have been sorting. I've been sorting things. I'm answering a question right now about whether this reporting will be available. It is being live streamed on Facebook, on the Atlanta Beltline Partnerships Facebook. So you can go back and watch it anytime because it's on there. So in general, people have asked, should I appeal? Should I just go ahead and appeal to get the freeze? Is that worth it? One person also added, if you are just appealing for the homestead exemption, do you also get the freeze?
If you're just appealing for the homestead exemption, you do not get the freeze. All that is about the homestead exemption. You really have to appeal either value or uniformity to get the freeze.
And so in general, people had different questions about whether it makes sense to appeal in their situation. So can you go through and probably just give some examples of when it makes sense to appeal?
I mean, really, a lot of it depends on, you know, how willing you are to go to the Board of Equalization hearing. It's, you know, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the Board of Equalization is not a scary thing. It's actually, you know, definitely worth doing. If you have any sort of argument for lowering the value, I think it's worth appealing it. You know, if the amount of savings on your taxes would be really, really small, it may not be worth your time, but that's really what you're doing. You're trying to figure out, you know, is this, you know, reduction in my taxes going to be worth the time it's going to take for me to show up at this Board of Equalization hearing?
Right.
I can't answer that for you. What I can do is kind of give you the tools to, you know, what information you want to gather to do that. And then you have to sort of do the cost benefit analysis.
And if you think I want to appeal, should you appeal based on all of the bases that you think you can support?
I think so. I think it's worth doing that. There are some people that say that, you know, so one of our concerns is that the sales from 2020 seem to be, you know, higher, and so, which is not at all what we were expecting to see in, in a pandemic year, but somehow the prices for sales, a lot of them are higher than what had been in the past. And so there are people that will say that, don't even do a value appeal because it's going to be hard to argue that. And that's something that the appraiser is going to be able to go in and really hammer on. But I just, if there's a possibility of an argument, I don't want to foreclose that. And if you don't check the box at the initial stage, then you can't raise it in the hearing. And if you check the box and you decide you don't really want to argue it, you can try to sort of shut it down at the hearing by saying, I'm not talking about that. I'm only talking uniformity today. And, hopefully you can kind of shut that down. But I think it's worth checking everything you possibly can.
Okay. There are a fair number of people who bought their homes in 2020, and they've got questions about whether to appeal or not. So if, for instance, if I bought my home in 2020 and there's evidence that the value has actually gone down, can I appeal? Does it make sense to appeal?
If you have evidence, it's worth trying. It's a big uphill battle because, again, the default is that the amount you paid is going to be the fair market value. But I mean, I've seen other people that there was one person where the developer had promised a whole bunch of things that didn't come to pass. And so, basically their paying was based on having these amenities available, and they weren't there. And so they appealed saying, this isn't worth what I paid for it. Or there was another person where, they discovered condition problems after the sale. And so, if there are conditions that would justify a lower value, it's worth trying.
And so even if, for instance, the appraised value now is, or the fair market value that they're claiming is lower than the purchase price, if you still think you've got evidence, is it worth appealing still?
I guess the danger, and this actually brings up a good question that I'm not sure the answer to. The statute basically says that the value the year after a sale should be the sale, but there's also a statute that says that the outcome from the Board of Equalization hearing is basically limited to what is in the notice of assessment. So where you have someone who really the value should have been the sale value, but they're getting a lower fair market value, I don't think the outcome could be going up to the sale price, but it's possible. I'm not 100% sure about that answer.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people are hung up on is the idea that when they bought the house, the fair market value according to taxes was one amount. And then this year, the fair market value according to taxes is like skyrocketed, like way percentages and percentages over. So I've gotten several questions that are asking, hey, if it's gone up 25%, is that a good enough reason to appeal? But one thing that I want to mention is that what Stacy's been talking about are the basis for appeal are not like whether my value has gone up more, like whether my value has gone up. It's rather, it's whether my value makes sense compared to other houses' values. Right?
They have to have an argument for why the value should be lower. And it's one question that I always have, because I hear that a lot where, I bought my house and the taxes were this, and then I get in and suddenly the taxes are so much higher. And is it that the value went up, or is it that there was a change in the homestead exemption? Because that's often the case. I talked to somebody actually today where they had actually bought the house from someone who happened to have the disabled veterans exemption, which is one of the very best exemptions. And so, when they were looking at what to expect from the taxes, they looked at what that veteran was paying and didn't pay attention to what the type of exemption was. And so, the exemption that he was getting had resulted in a very low amount of tax, but at the same, the same house value, the person who bought it only gets a basic exemption, and so they're going to have to pay a lot more in taxes. So, you know, what we're talking about is looking at the value of the house, not the amount of the taxes. And that's a pretty big distinction, especially for people who are buying the home, because they don't really realize that the you know, the estimate that they have for the taxes is not necessarily what they're going to pay. Does that make sense? You're muted.
Sorry, there were some other questions about some like general, like when you're putting together an appeal question, like some people talked about when there are other properties that are renovated versus mine that's not. And all of us who have done any of this work have had that come up a lot. And Stacy mentioned before that sometimes you'll see that a house is supposedly an unqualified sale just because it was basically flipped. And she has, and I have too, used comps of that first sale when it was sold as like a not flipped, not fancy house, to try to use that as a comparison instead. Do you have other tips like that, Stacy?
Well, and the other thing that sometimes you'll get pushback on is if you have condition issues, like, you know, the roof needs replacing or something like that, they'll say, well, that's just delayed maintenance, and that's not something that should reduce the value. But again, the standard is, what would a reasonable buyer pay for your home? And a reasonable buyer is going to take that stuff into account. So, you know, try and push on that, you know, yeah, this is stuff that, you know, that needs to be repaired, but it would affect the value.
So I think one like big thing is that you can appeal based on something affecting the value, like based on the understanding that they're not getting that this thing affects the value of your home in a way that it doesn't affect the value of someone else's home. So someone asked about, what if you're in a blighted neighborhood or you're like right next to a property that's run down? Well, then that makes the house on the other side of that blighted property a better comparison to your house than a house on the other side of the neighborhood that's like around a bunch of fancy properties. So you can think of it in that way.
Yeah. Think about it. You're basically making this argument to 3 other taxpayers. You're going to have a lot of the same concerns that you have, and you want to try and give them something to hang their hat on. You know, you want them to feel for you that your tax value should be lower, and find a way to justify that.
Okay, and then we've gotten some more. Someone did ask about comparing condos, which we've done before. I'm gonna like just throw out some ways that your home might differ from a higher price property, ways to compare them that aren't just typically. So if you live off a dirt road, we had a client who lived off a dirt road, and that was a great, really, like when we went to the hearing, it was really influential because the fact that he lived off a dirt road meant that people couldn't build a bunch of fancy things around there. If you're in a condo, especially, what your view is, what your parking spot is, those sorts of things can mean that you can compare your condo to other condos. Condos can be difficult because the best comps for your condo are going to be other condos in your complex, not so much condos in other complexes. A lot of times what the people in these hearings are looking at is, does this make sense to me? That, like Stacy said, there are other taxpayers. So if an argument makes sense to you, it'll probably make sense to them. You just have to remember that the whole thing hinges on whether you can find comparison properties that you can argue are good comparison properties for yours. So, and someone asked something about what the appraiser made the decision off of. A lot of times that's some kind of analytics that I don't understand, like a lot of data. Stacy might know more about that. But
well, it's something that's generated by a computer, so that they have not actually seen your house.
Right. Which is why sometimes they can be wrong. They can think you have 3 bathrooms and you have 2, which can automatically, once they come out and look at your house, lower the value of your property. Suddenly the property's worth a lot less based on their discovery, based on what you've told them. So, so there are a lot of arguments like that can be in there. Other example arguments? Do you have a good parking spot versus someone else, or vice versa? Do you have amenities or nearby conveniences that a comparison property doesn't? You weren't recently renovated. If you have asbestos walls, we've had someone use that successfully. When you get to the point where you filed the appeal and you've been assigned appraiser, you can ask them for their comps. Generally, they're going to have them a little closer to the hearing date, not like I applied, I got my here, like I applied to appeal and I want those comps immediately. They're going to have them closer to like when you get more into that phase of it, but they can give you their comps and you can use those to base your comps off of, and you can look at their comps and say, that doesn't make sense. That was renovated like 2 years ago. So you do have all of those options as well. There was, oh yes. So somebody mentioned that there was like an inconsistency in how they valued the person's land versus how they valued the building. Like one went up a certain percentage, the other went up differently. Is that any kind of basis for appeal?
It may be, and that's, we tend to look at the total fair market value divided by the square footage of the house. But sometimes if they're not valuing the land equally, that can be an argument. Or if there's a problem with the land. So like if my house, our lot is a lot smaller than a lot of the ones around ours because we're kind of near the corner, and so the lot from the other side cuts ours off. And so, I can look at, the overall value for the land and then divide that by the square footage of the land and compare it to the same for, some of these bigger ones. And it may not be, comparable. Now, in my case, it actually was, so I was not able to argue that in my appeal, but that's something you can look at. And I've even had someone talk about for example, the land in Buckhead is valued differently than the land in like Bankhead. The problem there is that what they're doing is they're looking at what sells, and the land in Buckhead may sell for more. But there may be a social justice argument there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just gonna ask also, there was a question about what constitutes a qualified sale. If someone sold vacant land to the Beltline Improvement District at an inflated value since it's going to become part of the Beltline, is that viewed as a qualified sale versus someone further down the street selling a lot for house construction? So they asked about whether that would be a uniform comparison. I mean, generally you aren't comparing like commercial properties to residential property anyway.
Right.
That's what your question was.
Yeah, and to the extent that, maybe somebody sold a parcel of land for an inflated value, you look for other parcels of land and argue that, these others are more comparable.
Right.
The other thing on land is that, if there's, some sort of condition to the land that affects the buildability or the value, then, you can argue that. So like if there's a ditch in the back, or if it's, sloped so it floods, or, things like that, those all affect the value. If it turns out that your house sits on the only buildable spot, comparing your house to a bigger house, it's not fair because you couldn't do a bigger house on this lot. So there are some arguments that you can make. Again, what you're trying to do is sort of give the Board of Equalization something to hang their hat on. So, if you're a little bit creative, maybe it'll work.
And then there was one person who asked about, they're waiting on their 2019 hearing, and will that freeze the 2020 prices?
It will. Yeah, and then also some people who actually just had their 2019 or even 2018 appeals, or 2020 appeals, if the decision was during this sort of time while they were putting out the notice of assessment, some of those, the value, the 2021 assessment notices don't reflect the freeze. they should go back and correct it. What I would suggest for anyone who's had their hearing, if it's not reflecting on it, check back before the deadline. You can appeal, just reserve your rights, but they should implement it. And they're usually pretty good about that. You may need to call and just confirm that they're doing that. And if you can't get confirmation that you're getting the freeze, go ahead and appeal it. And then you can withdraw it if they do implement it. For the people who are pending appeal, again, I would reach out to the appraiser's office and just say, you know, hey, we've got this appeal pending. I just want to confirm that I am going to get the freeze. I will say, if your appeal is pending and you do not go ahead and appeal now, you need to be very sure that you show up for that Board of Equalization hearing, because if you don't show up for that, then you don't get the freeze and you've lost the right to appeal for this year. So, you know, just be very aware that, you know, these hearings are going on. I had one where, you know, we had gotten it rescheduled, I don't know, a gazillion times as we were trying to combine the homestead exemption appeal and the value appeal. And we finally had a hearing and then they deferred it. And so when they finally rescheduled it, we didn't get notice. We got notice of all these others and we didn't get notice of the rescheduled appeal, even though it was mailed to the same address. And so we had to fight to get the freeze on that one.
Okay, so one question that a couple people had was, so basically they compared it to Prop 13 in California that limits annual increases of assessments unless something with the title changes. Does Atlanta have anything similar that limits how much your property value can go up year to year?
No. The closest thing is the floating exemption, which again, I'm going to talk about at the end. But there's nothing that limits them right now.
Okay, and someone also mentioned that the appraisers in the hearing were talking about equity value. Can you talk about what they meant by that?
Actually, that's a really good question. So I've been talking about the tax appraisers are supposed to.
Sorry, Stacy, you went out for me. I don't know if you glitched for others. Can you just start over answering it?
Yeah, and actually I just got a thing that my internet is unstable for some reason, so hopefully it won't glitch again. Equity is uniformity. Again, we call it uniformity because the appraisers are supposed to appraise things uniformly across the neighborhoods. And if they don't do that, then it's not fair, which also translates to if they're not uniform, it's not equitable. So, so when appraisers are talking equity, they're talking uniformity.
And so another question, if the standard is what would a reasonable person pay, if the next block is in a separate tax district or like neighborhood, and the county doesn't want to put that in their equation, how do we counter that? Is that written into a law?
I don't think that's written into a law. And you know, basically what you would do is you would argue that, you know, hey, my house is on the fringes of this neighborhood. My house is much more comparable to this other neighborhood right here, and just, you know, lay out that argument.
Okay. And there was kind of a more specific question. If you appeal and your rate is frozen and by some miracle the next year assessments are lowered, would you be stuck with the higher frozen rate? And I know that we've talked about this before, Stacy.
Yeah, and technically you are. Technically it is frozen at the value before. I do think that sometimes they if it's a mass revaluation, then they may go ahead and lower the value anyway. But yeah, there is that risk. If the values go down the following year, you may lose out on that. But I guess what are the odds that they're going to do that?
Yeah. If I appealed in 2018 and it was frozen, does that mean it can go up this bill even though this one is based on 2020 valuation? Which I think is a very good question.
It is, because actually it's based on 2021 valuation, but it's based on January 1, 2021. So these are the 2021 values. They're not the last year's value. They're 2021 values. It's just based on the 2020 sales. And yes, the 2018 freeze was for 2018, 2019, and 2020. So as soon as the 2021 values came out, they were free to jack those up, 3 years worth of increases. And those are the ones that I think are going to probably be most justified in appealing, because it's going to be a big jump for a lot of those appeals.
Okay. So this person asked, on the assessment, does it show where your taxes were frozen?
Well, if your taxes were frozen, it should show the, if you're talking about the appeal freeze, it should show the last year's value and this year's value being the same.
Okay. Let's see. I think I got through everything but most of the value cap questions. So just one final question from this section. Do we know how often an appeal is approved, like what the percentage is? I do know that plenty of people never show up to their hearing, and so their appeal just never basically gets dismissed effectively, but I don't know if you have other percentages.
I don't have any hard data. I just anecdotally, my experience is that the vast majority of them get at least a small decrease in value, just kind of the bonus for showing up. It's certainly not 100% that way. I've had at least one where we showed up and they stuck with the value that the tax assessor said. But again, even if you lose, you get the freeze. So I think it's a pretty good risk.
Okay, so I think that's it for now. So definitely still a good number of people asking about the value cap. So hopefully we can get that in.
Yeah, stick around, and even if we have to stop the recording or something, I'll answer that question. But I do want to quickly, so submitting your appeal, you can submit the appeal in person, by mail, or online. If you're in person, they received it. You can probably also ask for a receipt showing that they did. If you mail it, definitely mail it in a way that you can prove you did it, because you have to have it. It has to be postmarked by August, on or before August 5th, and they have to receive it. And so if either of those things doesn't happen, then it's not a valid appeal. So you want to be able to have proof that did happen. An online appeal can actually, you get a confirmation right away. So it's actually kind of the safest way now. It used to be, it wasn't the greatest way, but now their system is pretty good. The deadline, again, August 5th. If you don't get the appeal filed on or before August 5th, then you've lost the chance to do it. Let's talk about how to find the appeal form. Basically, you want to go to appeals. That's going to give you two options. You want to choose the property appeals, go to the methods for appeal. So, online filing, you scroll down, and then there's an online services that you can click on to go to for the online appeal. For a manual appeal, if you want to actually do a paper appeal, you can actually find the form down at the bottom of that page. Click on the 2021 appeal form. It'll bring up a PDF, and you can print that out and do it just the paper form. This is what the paper form looks like. I'm going to run through the important pieces of this, because the important information that's on this one page is also going to be the same important information in the online system. It's just the online one kind of walks you through different pages. But the necessary information, the minimum you need to be able to appeal is you want to be sure to put your owner's name, your address, your contact information, the property ID or parcel ID. Again, that's on the assessment notice. So you want to fill that in. You want to put the grounds for appeal, and you want to check every ground for appeal that applies. If you're doing it on value, you want to check value. If you're doing uniformity, you want to check uniformity. And if you're doing exemption denied, you want to check exemption denied. Do you want to check, all 3, 2, 1, whatever applies, you want to be sure to check whatever you're going to do. If you don't check it on the box now, you can't argue it at the hearing. So, so the default should be, if you think you might, go ahead and check that box. You need to be sure to put an owner's opinion of value. And that's where, the goal of doing the research is to try and come up with what value can you justify based on the comparables that you've seen. If you don't have time to do the research to be able to get a really solid value, you want to lowball this. You're not locked in with the value that you have here. You can actually argue a different value. And then you have to sign it. Ideally, you also want to indicate that you want to go to Board of Equalization. You want to check 85%. Basically, this is when they do the temporary tax bill, they're going to bill you at 85% of the value in the notice of assessment or last year's value, whichever is less. And then you'll have to pay whatever the difference is at the end of the appeal. But this way, you kind of get the tax break until the appeal is completed. And hopefully you'll get the value down low enough that either no taxes are owed or only a little bit is owed. Again, the owner's opinion of value is the crucial thing. You want to be sure to put a number here. It doesn't have to be the final number, but if you do have one that you can argue, that's the best one to put in here. If you don't, then go ahead and do sort of a lowball number. To do an online appeal, I just want to kind of run through this real quick because I don't want to take any time. But basically with an online appeal, you just go to online services, go to the smart file. If you already have a login, if you use this system to apply for your homestead exemption, or if you've done an appeal in the past, then you can just log in with the information you have. If you don't remember the password, it's real easy to create a new password. And if you don't have an account, then you just click on the create an account. That's going to require you to have an email because it'll ask you to enter an email and a password, and it's going to send an email to that email address. And then you have to click on that link to be able to activate the online services. Once you're in, you're going to go to available filings, look for appeals, residential and commercial real property. You go to begin filing. You're going to enter the parcel ID. It's going to come up with your property, and you click start filing. And then you're going to run through the different pages. Just be sure to go through each of them. A lot of it they already have filled in, and then you fill in what's needed. I want to just talk about a couple of things. The big difference between an online appeal and a paper appeal is that if you're doing a homestead exemption appeal and value or uniformity or both, then you may have to, you actually will have to submit 2 separate appeals. They have to be separate because once you click on the homestead exemption denied, once you say, yes, I'm appealing homestead exemption denied, the other grounds will disappear. I have actually done this and argued that, I was appealing both of them because you can do that in the paper appeal. But I've recently gotten a lot of pushback and they're like, just do 2, just do 2. So what you should do is if you're going to do an online appeal for homestead exemption and value, do it, so, go through and do the homestead exemption and then get that submitted, then go back into available filings and start over and do a value appeal. It's ridiculous, but you have to. The rest of this is just to show you that everything on here is the stuff that's on the paper appeal. So all that stuff still applies. It does have a block for you to indicate why, to explain why you're choosing the value you have. You don't have to fill this in. If you have, information to put in there, you can, but you don't have to. It also has a place to put in attachments. If you have attachments that you want to put in and you don't have them right now, you can actually log out and then come back and you go under my filings and you can start back in, just go back to the attachments. But the deadline is is August 5th. If you don't have attachments ready and that deadline is coming, you want to submit it. It's also not necessary to attach anything. you can provide all the evidence later in the process, so you don't have to attach anything, but if you do want to, this is where you do it. You want to hit submit only once your filing is complete. It will ask you to confirm that. And then if you do it successfully, you will come up with this confirmation page. If you do not get a confirmation page, you have not actually submitted the appeal. And that's why the online appeal, if you see this, then woohoo, you actually filed your appeal. And then the other good thing about the online system is that you can also come back and double check things. You can look at my filings to see if it has any status update on the appeal. And you can go to the message center to see if there's any messages about the appeal. In this case, there's already one because it's actually already sent an email saying, congratulations, you filed your appeal.
There was a quick question in the chat. What's the maximum number of attachments that can be included on the online appeal form?
I have no idea.
A good question.
Yeah, for a homestead exemption, I want to say it was like, it was either 6 or 9 that I don't know about for the appeal. But again, if you start attaching things and it doesn't get everything, you can submit the rest of it later in the process.
And there was also a good question about people who choose to be billed at 85% in their appeal. The question was, if the appeal is granted and successful, will the homeowner get refunded based on the recalculation of the lower assessment?
Yeah, so if it turns out, so again, the bill is going to be either 85% of the new value or last year's value, whichever is lower. So what we've seen is a lot of times that they do it on last year's value and the resulting value ends up being a little bit more than last year's value. So there is some taxes owed at the end, even though it's, they end up getting a reduction of more than 15% of the value, the assessed value.
Right. Sorry.
If it turns out that they've actually paid more, if it turns out that the value they end up with is lower than the amount that they billed at, then you will get a refund. It usually takes about, I don't know, like 45 days, because they wait the 30 days to for an appeal, and then they send it over to the tax commissioner to sort out the final bill. And then from there, it takes another like 30, 45 days to get the refunds out. But you should get those refunds.
Perfect. And then a quick attachment question again. Does the system accept cell phone pictures?
I believe it will take PDFs, JPEGs, and so I've had a problem with it uploading a picture. Yeah, it should.
Okay, yeah, I think usually cell phone pictures are JPEG, so it should be fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
Though there are also, if it's not something with really sensitive material, there are a lot of like websites that will transition a document from one sort of thing to another. So there's always that option.
Yeah. Okay. So let's run through with respect to after your appeal is filed, because this is just the beginning. This, you're getting the appeal filed, then you're going to have that temporary tax bill that we've talked about. Then the county is going to give you a decision. The decision is either going to be no change or they're going to change it to some value. If it's no change, they send you automatically to the Board of Equalization. If not, then you have to take it in writing, ask that it be sent to the Board of Equalization. And then the Board of Equalization hearing is, where you really present your evidence to support the value. There is a 180-day rule from the date that you submit the appeal. They actually have 180 days to make that initial decision, the change or no change. The exception to that is if greater than 3% of the county digest appeal, then they can send a notice giving them an extra 180 days. But if they don't get that notice within more than 30 days before that 180 days is up, then basically you win. So whatever value you've asserted, that's going to be the value. This is kind of a rare thing, but they had a problem a few years ago, so it's worth mentioning. When you get that initial decision, you have the choice. Basically, if it's a no change, you want to make sure that it is certified to the Board of Equalization. The last few years, they have done that, so I think that it would be, but you want to just double check that that's what it says. If they offer to accept your value or offers a compromise value, you want to think about whether or not to accept that value. You can reach out to the appraiser and ask that they offer you the freeze for you accepting that value and not appealing on to Board of Equalization. If they're not going to give you that freeze, or if you're not comfortable with that value, then you definitely want to appeal to the Board of Equalization. And so you want to be sure that you in writing request that it continue on to the Board of Equalization. I want to give you just a few examples. This is the no change letter. If you get this letter, it's really cryptic. It's a little hard to understand, but the key is to confirm that it says in there that it's been certified to the Board of Equalization. This is the notice of change. You'll notice this looks an awful lot like your notice of assessment. The difference is that with this, you only get 30 days to appeal it. This is where basically they'll set out what value that they've decided to change it to. It's either going to be the value you suggested or some other value, not the old one, but something between the two probably. And so you want to look at that and see if this is something that you want to accept, and reach out and see if you can get the freeze or go ahead and appeal to the Board of Equalization within the 30 days. After that, you'll get a notice from the Board of Equalization scheduling the hearing. It will go to the Board of Equalization. Again, this is just 3 random taxpayers who have agreed to hear these cases. So, what you want to do is have your information ready to convince them that your value is better. The first thing you want to do is request the appraiser's comps by emailing boa.openrecords@fultoncountyga.gov. That's basically to ask for an open records request for the information that they have that they plan to use. So you want to do that as soon as you receive that hearing notice. You can actually try before then, but usually they wait until kind of the last minute to provide this stuff. They are supposed to provide it to you. If you request it at least 10 days before the hearing, they're supposed to give it to you at least 7 days before the hearing. So request that information so you know what they're working with. And reach out to the county appraiser ahead of time. See if you can reach an agreement. If the two of you can reach an agreement, then you can actually have the appraiser present that agreement to the Board of Equalization. And once that gets approved, you get the 3-year freeze. So that can be really useful, especially if you have a reasonable argument. Then a lot of times you can reach an agreement on what the value should be. The burden of proof is on the assessor's office. This means that they have to prove that their value is based in fact. It's usually pretty easy for them because they'll just have the computer spit out a set of comps that's going to be like 5 other properties that support this value. And they'll usually have one chart that's the sales values and then one chart that's the equity or uniformity. And, basically if they show that to the Board of Equalization, that's usually enough to meet their burden of proof. So then what's going to happen is that it then turns to you to try and justify a different value. And for that, you want to be sure that you bring in 5 copies of any evidence that you have, if at all possible. Because basically you want to have 1 copy for each of the 3 board members, 1 for the appraiser, and then 1 for you to use while you're going through it. Be sure to bring any evidence that you have, any photos, repair estimates, appraisals. Do a chart with the comparables to show the different houses that support your value. All that evidence you want to bring with you to the hearing. The outcome of the hearing is frozen for 3 years. That's only if you show up. If you don't show up or provide evidence, then they're not going to give you the freeze. So it's really important that you show up.
But if you do negotiate and you come to an agreement with them, ask if they'll give you the freeze anyway, in writing, in an email.
Yeah, if the appraiser is going to agree to something, always ask them for that freeze. And if they can't give you the freeze, then you want to ask that they at least, take it to the Board of Equalization to be able to get the freeze. At the end of your hearing, you'll usually be handed this. That basically it's just a decision form where they tell what the value is, and they don't do anything fancy about what kind of evidence was persuasive. They just say based on evidence, but this is what you'll end up with. They'll also give you a little sheet that tells about your right to appeal to Superior Court. So if you're not happy with the Board of Equalization decision, you do have the right to appeal to Superior Court. You have to do that in writing within 30 days. You need to notify the Board of Assessors in writing during that time frame. And then it would go to the Superior Court. And at Superior Court, if you're able to get the value reduced a certain percentage, you can get attorney's fees. So at this stage, it's a lot easier to find attorneys that are willing to help with this. Although there are plenty of attorneys that will help you with the appeal, even at the Board of Equalization level. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to help.
We have a question about, is the BOE hearing online? Is it on Zoom or is it live?
So I don't know what they're going to do without the emergency orders. With the emergency orders, they did start doing Zoom hearings. And initially Zoom was the default. Then at some point they switched it back to in-person being the default, and you could request a Zoom hearing. I don't know if they're going to keep Zoom hearings as an option, with the 2021, but hopefully we'll be out of the worst of it. As long as there are emergency orders, it does allow for the Zoom hearings. So the short answer is I don't know. Okay, so I think at this point, let's just go to questions.
Okay, so someone asked, what happens if you're out of state and they schedule you for a hearing?
You have the right to change your hearing one time for any reason. The problem is when you do that, basically you just go back in the hopper. You don't have any say in what that second date is. And that second date, they're going to expect you to show up. So you can try. You can. The general rule is that you're allowed that one kind of free bite at the apple, and then after that they expect you to show up. But really, it's that you're allowed one time for any reason, and I think that they should still allow you to postpone it based on cause. If you're unable to make it because of health reasons, or you're unavailable or whatever, you should be able to make an argument. If it is a Zoom one, then it's not going to be a problem. You can inquire whether a Zoom hearing is an option, but yeah, that is, it's a little dicey when you're trying to continue it and you don't know if you're going to be around for the second date.
Okay, so the rest of them really are about the value cap. So people are definitely like, and just for everyone on this call, that makes you like literally everyone else. Everyone is confused about the value cap. That is very normal to be confused about the value cap. It is super confusing, which is why I'm not explaining the value cap to you because I still kind of find it confusing. So Stacy, please, value cap.
What I'm going to do is share that screen again.
Stacy, while you're pulling that up, I just want to share that I put it in the chat, but we know this is confusing, and it does get easier as you do it and see it in person, I think.
Yeah.
So we and volunteers will be hosting a couple of days to help you guys walk through the appeal process if you decide you want to appeal and you need a little bit more help. So I put that bit.ly link in the chat. You can sign up for that. There are 2 dates in July. I will also email it out again with the recording so you can watch it again and see if you want that extra help.
Yeah, and then you can fast forward to the parts that are most useful. Yeah, and I will say that research your first time through it really is tedious and difficult. When you've been doing it a few times, it gets a lot easier, and you start getting better at spotting what's going to help and what's not going to help. And certainly the volunteers that we have helping for the workshops are, have gotten some experience in doing that, so that it'll be useful. Okay, the value cap versus floating exemption. The value cap does cap your value. For the people who got it initially, it was based on, I think, 2016, 2017, or 2018 values, or maybe it was 16, 17. Anyways, in this example, I think it was a 2016 value that was, or 2017 value that was frozen. And so what happened is by 2019, so this was from 2018. In 2018, basically her value jumped to $296,800. That was a huge jump. And actually I don't have it. The base year value floating exemption amount is the 40% of the base year. So the way the tax bills are done is they have an overall value for your home, and then they take 40% of that, and that's going to be the taxable value. So they're only going to be taxing you on 40% of the value. With the value cap, they're going to take a base year, which again, in this case, I think it was 2017, and it was based on sort of a stagnated value. And the 40% for that year was $64,400. The 40% of $296,800 is $118,720. So that's a huge difference. And that's why the value cap is so tremendously helpful for the categories it covers. The way they calculate it is that they stick with that $118,720, the 40% of the overall fair market value. And then as part of the exemption amount, so what they're doing is they're taking the assessed values, subtracting the exemptions to be able to get the net assessment. The net assessment then gets multiplied by the tax rate or the millage rate to come out with the amount of taxes that are owed. So they're going to take that floating exemption and make it part of the exemption amount that's being subtracted. So they're subtracting $67,124 from $118,720, and using that difference plus the $40,000 to equal the $91,596. So that's how they get the floating exemption reduction to the same value that I get by calculating it the way it makes sense to me, which is to take the value cap. You take the base year value, increase it by the allowed increase, which in that first year was, I think, 1.042 or something like that, something crazy. That can be no more than 3%. And then subtracting whatever other exemptions there are. So that's the way it works. The problem is, as I said, it doesn't apply to all categories of your taxes. So for example, bonds and schools are the two main ones where people run into problems when the exemptions are not enough to cover everything. So school taxes in Fulton County, or the city of Atlanta school taxes, all they get is a $50,000 exemption, except that after the first 10,000. So if somebody's value was, the taxable value was 50,000, they would still have to pay taxes on 10,000 worth of it, unless they had a senior exemption. And so with the 50,000 exemption, that's all they would get. They don't get the floating exemption. So, if the value is, 118,720, you subtract 50,000, there's a lot more left owing than, there's a lot more left to be taxed than 27,000. And so that's where the tax bills get hit hard on, these increased values.
Okay, someone asked, so then the 67,124 number, which is the assessed value for showing the capped assessment, where did that come from? How did you get that number?
So I used the base year floating. So basically the 40% value for my client in 2018 was 64,400. So that's the base year. That is allowed to increase by up to 3% per year. The first year, they decided that actually the increase was basically just a little bit more than 1%. And so I multiplied the base year or increase the base year by that, little over 1%. And that's how I got the 67,124. Does that make sense?
Okay. And anyone feel free to put in the chat or in the Q&A if you still have some questions about this, because like I said, this is very confusing. But essentially, it's not a 3% cap on your fair market value, which I think what a lot of people were thinking was that it was a 3% cap on like something regarding fair market value.
Well, the other thing is that it's not automatic 3%. It's no more than 3%. It's based on the consumer price index. And so that's where it gets really confusing is, if you could just say, oh, well, increase this by 3% and then tax that, then it'd be a little bit easier, but you have to go and find what the consumer price index did for the year.
So is that, so someone asked, where did the 1% come from? I thought it was 3%. So that's what you're referring to?
Yeah, so actually the initial law went ahead and estimated, because they were using like 2 or 3 years worth of possible target base values. And so they averaged the consumer price index for that period. And that's how they got it was a multiplier of like 1.04 something.
And then we also have a question about what you meant by base year. What is the base year? Is it the year you bought the property? Is it the existing year? What's the base year?
So I believe the base year now would be the year prior to the year you get the exemption. So for example, if you bought the property and then applied for the homestead exemption immediately the following year, then it's going to be based on the prior year's value.
Okay. And where do you find what the percentage of the cap is this year, since it's not always 3%?
I don't know. I Google and try and find it. And yeah, because the other thing, the consumer price index is not like just one number, and I'm not 100% sure which number they use. So usually what I end up doing is when the tax bills come out, I sort of backfill the information. I look to see what the consumer price index information was, look at what the value, the percent increase was, and then see, which one makes sense. I know there's a better answer out there and I should have it, but I don't.
Okay, so those are all the questions that I see. We just got a few more. Goodness. Is the base year the year you bought the property or the year the value was frozen? Someone's still concerned about the base year.
Yeah, so the base year is the value they're using as the cap value. So again, what they're going to do is they're going to start with that base value, and each year it's allowed to go up as much as 3%. So, depending on how many years you are past that base year, you add that increase. And the base year is going to be generally the year prior to the year in which you get that exemption.
Okay. And there was one more question about Atlanta Beltline Partnership is answering. The help sessions are mostly by Zoom, but we did talk about having an in-person part.
Yes, if you decide that you would rather it be in person, we can work with you to do that. But for the most part, they will be via Zoom. But once you go to the registration form, you can indicate your preference and we'll work with you.
One quick thing on the back to the floating exemption. I don't have a full tax bill, but the notice of assessment does have a breakdown of the different taxes. And so you can see where different categories have different amounts of homestead exemptions. And that's because not all the exemptions apply to all of the different parts. So like in this example, the Atlanta bonds, there are no exemptions that apply. And so the value is the value for taxing that. For the school, this is one of those where the taxable value is less than 50,000, so they only get taxed on 10,000 of the value. So that's why, you know, homestead exemptions are a huge savings, but they're not the end of the story. You also have to appeal the values to be able to keep the overall taxes down. Okay. We've gone over, so I apologize. But are there any other questions or?
Sure. So we did go a couple minutes over, but I know that's complicated stuff. So thank you all for staying on, and Stacy and Carrie for your expertise. This is complicated stuff. So definitely join us if you guys want some more help. Those sessions will be on July 17th and July 21st. And I will send that out again probably tomorrow with the recording. So thank you all again. And please share this with anyone, your neighbors that you think might need this assistance as well. And I think with that, we can say good night and thank you again for attending. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.